Chapter 4 of Holiday House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kieran Metz. Holiday House by Catherine Sinclair, Chapter 4. The Prodigious Cake. Yet there's the joy that lifts their steps, that sparkles in their eyes, that talks or laughs or runs or shouts or plays, and speaks in all their looks and all their ways. Crabbe. Next day after the fire, Laura could think of nothing but what she was to do with the shilling that Uncle David had given her. And 1,000 plans came into her head, while many wants entered her thoughts, which never occurred before. So that if 20 shillings had been in her hand instead of 1, they would all have gone 20 different ways. Lady Harriet advised that it should be laid by till Laura had fully considered what she would like best, reminding her very truly that money is lame in coming, but flies in going away. "Many people can get a shilling, Laura," said her grandmamma, "but the difficulty is to keep it. For you know the old proverb tells that a fool and his money are soon parted." "Yes, miss, so give it to me, and I shall take care of your shilling," added Mrs. Crabtree, holding her hand out to Laura, who felt that if her money once disappeared into that capacious pocket, she would never see it again. "Children have no use for money. That shilling will only burn a hole in your purse, till it is spent on some foolish thing or other. You will be losing your thimble soon, or mislaying your gloves, for all these things seem to fly in every direction, as if they got legs and wings as soon as they belong to you. So then that shilling may replace what is lost." Mrs. Crabtree looked as if she would eat it up, but Laura grasped her treasure still tighter in her hand, exclaiming, "No, no, this is mine. Uncle David never thought of my shilling being taken care of. He meant me to do whatever I liked with it. Uncle David says he cannot endure saving children, and that he wishes all money were turned into slates when little girls keep it longer than a week." "I like that," said Harry eagerly. "It is so pleasant to spend money, when the shopkeeper bows to me over the counter so politely, and asks what I please to want." "Older people than you like spending money, Master Harry, and spend it whether they'd have it or no, but the greatest pleasure is to keep it. For instance, Miss Laura, whatever she sees worth a shilling in any shop, might be hers if she pleases, so then it is quite as good as her own. We shall look in at the bazaar every morning to fix upon something that she would like to have, and then consider of it for 2 or 3 days. Laura thought this plan so very unsatisfactory, that she lost no time in getting her shilling changed into 2 sixpences, one of which she immediately presented to Harry, who positively refused for a long time to accept of it, insisting that Laura should rather buy some pretty plaything for herself. But she answered that it was much pleasanter to divide her fortune with Harry than to be selfish and spend it all alone. "I am sure, Harry," added she, "if this money had been yours, you would have said the same thing and given the half of what you got to me. So now let us say no more about that. But tell me what would be the best use to make of my 6pence. "You might buy that fine red morocco purse we saw in the shop window yesterday," observed Harry, looking very serious and anxious on being consulted. "Do you remember how much we both wished to have it?" "But what is the use of a purse with no money to keep in it?" answered Laura, looking earnestly at Harry for more advice. "Think again of something else." "Would you like a new doll?" "Yes, but I have nothing to dress her with." "Suppose you buy that pretty geranium in a red flower pot at the gardener's." "If it would only live for a week, I might be tempted to try, but flowers will always die with me. They seem to wither when I so much as look at them. Do you remember that pretty fuchsia that I almost drowned the first day grandmamma gave it to me? And we forgot for a week afterwards to water it at all. I am not a good flower doctor." "Then buy a gold watch at once," said Harry, laughing, "or a fine pony with a saddle to ride on." "Now, Harry, pray be quite in earnest. You know I might as well attempt to buy the moon as a gold watch, so think of something else." "It is very difficult to make a good use of money," said Harry, pretending to look exceedingly wise. "Do you know, Laura, I once found out that you could have 12 of those large ship biscuits we saw at the baker's shop for 6d. Only think, you could feed the whole town, and make a present to everybody in the house besides. I dare say Mrs. Crabtree might like one with her tea. All the maids would think them a treat. You could present one to Frank, another to old Andrew, and there would still be some left for these poor children at the cottage." "Oh, that is the very thing!" cried Laura, running out of the room to send Andrew off with a basket, and looking as happy as possible. Not long afterwards, Frank, who had returned from school, was standing at the nursery window, when he suddenly called out in a voice of surprise and amazement, "Come here, Harry! Look at old Andrew! He is carrying something tied up in a towel, as large as his own head. What can it be?" "That is all for me. These are my biscuits," said Laura, running off to receive the parcel. And though she heard Frank laughing while Harry told all about them, she did not care, but brought her whole collection triumphantly into the nursery. "Oh, fancy! How perfect!" cried Harry, opening the bundle. "This is very good fun." "Here are provisions for a siege," added Frank. "You have at least got enough for your money, Laura." "Take one yourself, Frank," said she, reaching him the largest. And then, with the rest all tied in her apron, Laura proceeded up and down stairs, making presents to every person she met, till her whole store was finished. And she felt quite satisfied and happy, because everybody seemed pleased, and returned many thanks, except Mrs. Crabtree, who said she had no teeth to eat such hard things, which were only fit for sailors going to America or the West Indies. "You should have brought me a pound of sugar, Miss Laura, and that might have been a present worth giving." "You are too sweet already, Mrs. Crabtree," said Frank, laughing. "I shall send you a sugar cane from the West Indies to beat Harry and Laura with, and a whole barrel of sugar for yourself, from my own estate."
"Oh, none of your nonsense, Master Frank. Get out of the nursery this moment. You with an estate, indeed!
You will not have a place to put your foot upon soon, except the topmast in a man of war, where all the bad boys in a ship are sent." "Perhaps, as you are not to be the captain, I may escape, and be dining with the officers sometimes. I mean to send you home a fine new India shawl, Mrs. Crabtree, the very moment I arrive at Madras, and some china teacups from Canton."
"Fiddlesticks and nonsense," said Mrs. Crabtree,
who sometimes enjoyed a little jesting with Frank.
"Keep all them rattletraps till you are a rich nabob, and come home to look for Mrs. Frank. A fine wife she will be. Ladies that get fortunes from India are covered all over with gold chains and gold muslins and scarlet shawls. She will eat nothing but curry and rice, and never put her foot to the ground except to step into her carriage."
"I hope you are not a gypsy to tell fortunes," cried Harry, laughing. "Frank would die rather than take such a wife." "Or at least I would rather have a tooth drawn than do it," added Frank, smiling. "Perhaps I may prefer to marry one of those old wives on the chimney tops, but it is too serious to say I would rather die, because nobody knows how awful it is to die till the appointed day comes."
"Very true and proper, Master Frank," replied Mrs. Crabtree. "You speak like a printed book sometimes, and you deserve a good wife."
"Then I shall return home some day with chests of gold, and let you choose one for me as quiet and good-natured as yourself, Mrs. Crabtree," said Frank, taking up his books and hastening off to school, running all the way, as he was rather late, and Mr. Lexicon, the master, had promised a grand prize for the boy who came most punctually to his lessons, which everybody declared that Frank was sure to gain, as he had never once been absent at the right moment. Major Graham often tried to tease Frank by calling him the Professor, asking him questions which it was impossible to answer, and then pretending to be quite shocked at his ignorance, but no one ever saw the young scholar put out of temper by those tricks and trials, for he always laughed more heartily than any one else at the joke. "Now show me, Frank," said Uncle David one morning, "how do you advance 3 steps backwards?" "That is quite impossible unless you turn me into a crab." "Tell me then, which is the principal town in Caffraria?" "Is there any town there? I do not recollect it." Then so much the worse. How are you ever to get through life without knowing the chief town in Caffraria? I am quite ashamed of your ignorance. Now let us try a little arithmetic. Open the door of your understanding, and tell me, when wheat is 6 shillings a bushel, what is the price of a penny loaf? Take your slate and calculate that. Yes, Uncle David, if you will find out when gooseberries are 2 shillings the pint, what is the price of a 3-penny tart? You remind me of my old nursery song. The man in the wilderness asked me how many strawberries grew in the sea. I answered him as I thought it good, as many red herrings as grew in the wood. Some days after Laura had distributed the biscuits, she became very sorry for having squandered her shilling, without attending to Lady Harriet's good advice about keeping it carefully in her pocket for at least a week to see what would happen. A very pleasant way of using money now fell in her way, but she had been a foolish spendthrift, so her pockets were empty when she most wished them to be full. Harry came that morning after breakfast into the nursery, looking in a great bustle, and whispering to Laura, "What a pity your 6pence is gone! But, as Mrs. Crabtree says, we cannot both eat our cake and have it." "No," answered Laura, as seriously as if she had never thought of this before. "But why do you so particularly wish my money back today?" "Because such a very nice, funny thing is to be done this morning. You and I are asked to join the party, but I am afraid we cannot afford it. All our little cousins and companions intend going with Mr. Harwood, the tutor, at 12 o'clock, to climb up to the very top of Arthur's Seat, where they are to dine and have a dance. There will be about 20 boys and girls of the party, but everybody is to carry a basket filled with provisions for dinner, either cakes or fruit or biscuits, which are to be eaten on the great rock at the top of the hill. Now Grandmamma says we ought to have had money enough to supply what is necessary, and then we might have gone. But no one can be admitted who has not at least 6pence to buy something." "Oh, how provoking!" said Laura sadly. "I wonder when we shall learn always to follow Grandmamma's advice, for that is sure to turn out best in the end. I never take my own way without being sorry for it afterwards, so I deserve now to be disappointed and remain at home. But, Harry, your 6pence is still safe, so pray join this delightful party, and tell me all about it afterwards." "If I could take us both, I should be very happy, but I will not go without you, Laura, after you were so good to me, and gave me this present. No, no. I only wish we could do like the poor madman Grandmamma mentioned, who planted 6pences in the ground that they might grow into shillings." "Pray, what are you two looking so solemn about?" asked Frank, hurrying into the room at that moment, on his way to school. "Are you talking of some mischief that has been done already, or only about some mischief you are intending to do soon?" "Neither the one nor the other," answered Laura. "But oh, Frank, I am sure you will be sorry for us when we tell you of our sad disappointment." She then related the whole story of the party to Arthur's Seat, mentioning that Mr. Harwood had kindly offered to take charge of Harry and herself, but as her little fortune had been so foolishly squandered, she could not go, and Harry said it would be impossible to enjoy the fun without her, though Lady Harriet had given them both leave to be of the party. All the time that Laura spoke, Frank stood with his hands in his pockets, where he seemed evidently searching for something, and when the whole history was told, he said to Harry, "Let me see this poor little 6pence of yours. I am a very clever conjurer, and could perhaps turn it into a shilling." "Nonsense, Frank," said Laura, laughing. "You might as well turn Harry into Uncle David." "Well, we shall see," answered Frank, taking up the 6pence. "I have put the money into this box. Rattle it well. Once, twice, thrice. There, peep in. Now it is a shilling. I told you so." Frank ran joyously out of the room, being much amused with the joke, for he had put one of his own shillings into the box for Harry and Laura, who were excessively surprised at first, and felt really ashamed to take this very kind present from Frank, when he so seldom had money of his own. But they knew how generous he was, for he often repeated that excellent maxim, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." After a few minutes, they remembered that nothing could prevent them now from going with Mr. Harwood to Arthur's Seat, which put Laura into such a state of ecstasy that she danced round the room for joy, while Harry jumped upon the tables and chairs, tumbled head over heels, and called Betty to come immediately that they might get ready. When Mrs. Crabtree heard such an uproar, she hastened also into the room, asking what had happened to cause this riot, and she became very angry indeed to hear that Harry and Laura had both got leave to join in this grand expedition. "You will be spoiling all your clothes, and getting yourselves into a heat. I wonder her ladyship allows this. How much better you would be taking a quiet walk with me in the gardens. I shall really speak to Lady Harriet about it. The air must be very cold on the top of them great mountains. I am sure you will both have colds for a month after this tomfoolery." "Oh no, Mrs. Crabtree, I promise not to catch cold," cried Harry eagerly. "And besides, you can scarcely prevent our going now, for grandmamma has set out on her long airing in the carriage, so there is nobody for you to ask about keeping us at home, except Uncle David." Mrs. Crabtree knew from experience that Major Graham was a hopeless case, as he always took part with the children, and liked nothing so much for old and young as a ploy. So she grumbled on to herself, while her eyes looked as sharp as a pair of scissors with rage. "You will come back turned into scarecrows, with all your nice clean clothes in tatters," said she angrily. "But if there is so much as a speck upon this best new jacket and trousers, I shall know the reason why." "What a comfort it would be if there were no such things in the world as new clothes, for I am always so much happier in the old ones," said Harry. "People at the shops should sell clothes that will never either dirty or tear." "You ought to be dressed in fur, like Robinson Crusoe, or sent out naked, like the little savages," said Mrs. Crabtree, "or painted black and blue, like them wild old Britons that lived here long ago." "I am black and blue sometimes, without being painted," said Harry, escaping to the door. "Good-bye, Mrs. Crabtree. I hope you will not die of weariness without us. On our return we shall tell you of all our delightful adventures." About half an hour afterwards, Harry and Laura were seen hurrying out of the pastry cook, Mrs. Waddell's shop, bearing little covered baskets in their hands, but nobody could guess what was in them. They whispered and laughed together with very merry faces, looking the very pictures of happiness, and running along as fast as they could to join the noisy party of their cousins and companions, almost fearing that Mr. Harwood might have set off without them. Frank often called him Mr. Punctuality, as he was so very particular about his scholars being in good time on all occasions, and certainly Mr. Harwood carried his watch more in his hand than in his pocket, being in the habit of constantly looking to see that nobody arrived too late. Mail coaches or steamboats could hardly keep the time better, when an hour had once been named, and the last words that Harry heard when he was invited were, "Remember, sharp 12." The great clock of St. Andrew's Church was busy striking that hour, and every little clock in the town was saying the same thing, when Mr. Harwood himself, with his watch in his hand, opened the door and walked out, followed by a dozen of merry-faced boys and girls, all speaking at once, and vociferating louder than the clocks, as if they thought everybody had grown deaf. "I shall reach the top of Arthur's Seat first," said Peter Grey. "All of you follow me, for I know the shortest way. It is only a hop, step, and a jump." "Rather a long step," cried Robert Fordyce, "but I could lead you a much better way, though I shall show it to nobody but myself." "We must certainly drink water at St. Anthony's Well," observed Laura, "because whatever anyone wishes for, when he tastes it, is sure to happen immediately." "Then I shall wish that some person may give me a new doll," said Mary Forrester. "My old one is only fit for being lady's maid to a fine new doll." "I am in 99 minds what to wish for," exclaimed Harry. "We must take care not to be like the foolish old woman in the fairy tale, who got only a yard of black pudding." "I shall ask for a piebald pony, with a whip, a saddle, and a bridle," cried Peter Grey, "and for a week's holidays, and a new watch, and a spade, and a box of French plums, and to be the first on top of Arthur's Seat, and—" "Stop, Peter, stop! You can only have one wish at St. Anthony's Well, interrupted Mr. Harwood. If you ask more, you lose all. That is very hard, for I want everything, replied Peter. What are you wishing for, sir? What shall I ask for? Said Mr. Harwood, reflecting to himself. I have not a want in the world. Oh, yes, sir, you must wish for something, cried the whole party eagerly. Do invent something to ask, Mr. Harwood. Then I wish you may all behave well till we reach the top of Arthur's Seat, and all come safely down again. You may be sure of that already, said Peter, laughing. I set such a very good example to all my companions, and they never behave ill when I am present. No, not even by accident. When Dr. Algebra examined our class today, he asked Mr. Lexicon, what has become of the best boy in your school this morning? And the answer was, Of course you mean Peter Gray. He has gone to the top of Arthur's Seat with that excellent man, Mr. Harwood. Indeed. And pray, Master Peter, what bird whispered this story into your ear, seeing it has all happened since we left home? But people who are praised by nobody else often take to praising themselves. Who knows better? And here is Harry Graham, the very ditto of myself, so steady he might be fit to drill a whole regiment. We shall lead the party quite safely up the hill and down again without any ladders. And without wings, added Harry, laughing. But what are we to draw water out of the well with? Here are neither buckets, nor tumblers, nor glasses. I could lend you my thimble, said Laura, searching her pocket. That will hold enough of water for one wish, and every person may have the loan of it in turn. This is the very first time your thimble has been of use to anybody, said Harry, slyly, but I dare say it is not worn into holes with too much sewing. Therefore it will make a famous little magical cup for St. Anthony's Well. You know the fairies who dance here by moonlight lay their tablecloth upon a mushroom and sit round it to be merry, but I never heard what they use for a drinking cup. Harry now proceeded briskly along to the well, singing as he went a song which had been taught him by Uncle David, beginning, I wish I were a brewer's horse, 5 quarters of a year. I'd place my head where was my tail, and drink up all the beer. Before long, the whole party seated themselves in a circle on the grass around St. Anthony's Well, while any stranger who had chanced to pass might have supposed from the noise and merriment that the saint had filled his well with champagne and punch for the occasion, as everybody seemed perfectly tipsy with happiness. Mr. Harwood laughed prodigiously at some of the jokes, and made a few of his own, which were none of the best, though they caused the most laughter. For the boys thought it very surprising that so grave and great a man should make a joke at all. When Mary Forrester drank her thimbleful of water and wished for a new doll, Peter and Harry privately cut out a face upon a red-cheeked apple, making the eyes, nose, and mouth, after which they hastily dressed it up in pocket handkerchiefs and gave her this present from the fairies, which looked so very like what she had asked for that the laugh which followed was loud and long. Afterwards Peter swallowed his draught, calling loudly for a piebald pony, when Harry in his white trousers and dark jacket went upon all fours and let Peter mount on his back. It was very difficult, however, to get Peter off again, for he enjoyed the fun excessively, and stuck to his seat like Sinbad's old man of the sea, till at last Harry rolled round on his back, tumbling Peter head over heels into St. Anthony's Well, upon seeing which Mr. Harwood rose, saying he had certainly lost his own wish, as they had behaved ill and met with an accident already. Harry laughingly proposed that Peter should be carefully hung upon a tree to dry, till they all came down again, but the mischievous boy ran off so fast he was almost out of sight in a moment, saying, Now for the top of Arthur's Seat, and I shall grow dry with the fatigue of climbing. The boys and girls immediately scattered themselves all over the hill, getting on the best way they could, and trying who could scramble up fastest. But the grass was quite short, and as slippery as ice, therefore it became every moment more difficult to stand, and still more difficult to climb. The whole party began sliding whether they liked it or not, and staggered and tried to grasp the turf, but there was nothing to hold, while occasionally a shower of stones and gravel came down from Peter, who pretended they fell by accident. "Oh, Harry!" cried Laura, panting for breath, while she looked both frightened and fatigued. "If this were not a party of pleasure, I think we are sometimes quite as happy in our own gardens. People must be very miserable at home before they come out here to be amused. I wish we were cats or goats or anything that can stand upon a hill without feeling giddy." "I think this is very good fun," answered Harry, gasping and trying not to tumble for the 20th time. "You would like perhaps to be back in the nursery with Mrs. Crabtree." "No, no, I am not quite so bad as that. But Harry, do you ever really expect to reach the top? For I never shall, so I mean to sit down quietly here and wait till you all return." "I have a better plan than that, Laura. You shall sit upon the highest point of Arthur's Seat as well as anybody, before either of us is an hour older. Let me go first, because I get on famously, and you must never look behind, but keep tight hold of my jacket. So then every step I advance will pull you up also." Laura was delighted with this plan, which succeeded perfectly well, but they ascended rather slowly, as it was exceedingly fatiguing to Harry, who looked quite happy all the time to be of use, for he always felt glad when he could do anything for anybody, more particularly for either Laura or Frank. Now the whole party was at last safely assembled on the highest point of Arthur's Seat, so the boys threw their caps up in the air and gave 3 tremendous cheers, which frightened the very crows over their heads and sent a flock of sheep scampering down the mountainside. After that they planted Mr. Harwood's walking stick in the ground for a staff, while Harry tore off the blue silk handkerchief which Mrs. Crabtree had tied about his neck, and without caring whether he caught cold or not, he fastened it on the pole for a flag, being quite delighted to see how it waved in the wind most triumphantly, looking very like what sailors put up when they take possession of a desert island. "Now for business," said Mr. Harwood, sitting down on the rock and uncovering a prodigious cake, nearly as large as a cheese, which he had taken the trouble to carry with great difficulty up the hill. "I suppose nobody is hungry after our long walk. Let us see what all the baskets contain." Not a moment was lost in seating themselves on the grass, while the stores were displayed amidst shouts of laughter and applause which generally followed whatever came forth. Sandwiches, or as Peter Grey called them, savages, gingerbread, cakes, and fruit, all appeared in turn. Robert Fordyce brought a dozen of hard-boiled eggs, all dyed different colours, blue, green, pink, and yellow, but not one was white. Edmund Ashford produced a collection of very sour-looking apples, and Charles Forrester showed a number of little gooseberry tarts, but when it came time for Peter's basket to be opened, it contained nothing except a knife and fork to cut up whatever his companions would give him. "Peter, Peter, you shabby fellow," said Charles Forrester, reaching him one of his tarts, "you should be put in the treadmill as a sturdy beggar." "Or thrown down from the top of this precipice," added Harry, giving him a cake. "I wonder you can look any of us in the face, Peter." "I have heard," said Mr. Harwood, "that a stone is shown in Ireland called the Stone of Blarney, and whoever kisses it is never afterwards ashamed of anything he does. Our friend Peter has probably passed that way lately." "At any rate, I am not likely to be starved to death amongst you all," answered the impudent boy, demolishing everything he could get, and it is believed that Peter ate, on this memorable occasion, 3 times more than any other person, as each of the party offered him something, and he never was heard to say no. "I could swallow Arthur's Seat if it were turned into a plum pudding," said he, pocketing buns, apples, eggs, walnuts, biscuits, and almonds, till his coat stuck out all round like a balloon. "Has anyone anything more to spare?" "Did you ever hear," said Mr. Harwood, "that a pigeon eats its own weight of food every day? Now I am sure you and I know one boy in the world, Peter, who could do as much." "What is to be done with that prodigious cake you carried up here, Mr. Harwood?" answered Peter, casting a devouring eye upon it. "The crust seems as hard as a rhinoceros skin, but I dare say it is very good. One could not be sure, though, without tasting it. I hope you are not going to take the trouble of carrying that heavy load back again." "How very polite you are become all on a sudden, Peter," said Laura, laughing. "I should be very sorry to attempt carrying that cake to the bottom of the hill, for we would both roll down the shortest way together." "I am not over anxious to try it either," observed Charles Forrester, shaking his head. "Even Peter, though his mouth is constantly ajar, would find that cake rather heavy to carry, either as an inside or an outside passenger." "I can scarcely lift it at all," continued Laura, when Mr. Harwood had again tied it up in the towel. "What can be done?" "Here is the very best plan!" cried Harry, suddenly seizing the prodigious cake, and before anybody could hinder him, he gave it a tremendous push off the steepest part of Arthur's Seat, so that it rolled down like a wheel, over stones and precipices, jumping and hopping along with wonderful rapidity, amidst the cheers and laughter of all the children, till at last it reached the bottom of the hill, when a general clapping of hands ensued. "Now for a race!" cried Harry, becoming more and more eager. "The first boy or girl who reaches that cake shall have it all to himself." Mr. Harwood tried with all his might to stop the commotion, and called out that they must go quietly down the bank, for Harry had no right to give away the cake, or to make them break their legs and arms with racing down such a hill. But he might as well have spoken to an east wind and asked it not to blow. The whole party dispersed like a hive of bees that has been upset, and in a moment they were in full career after the cake. Some of the boys tried to roll down, hoping to get on more quickly. Others endeavoured to slide, and several attempted to run, but they all fell, and many of them might have been tumblers at Sadler's Wells, they tumbled over and over so cleverly. Peter Grey's hat was blown away, but he did not stop to catch it. Charlie Hume lost his shoe, Robert Fordyce sprained his ankle, and every one of the girls tore her frock. It was a frightful scene, such devastation of bonnets and jackets as had never been known before, while Mr. Harwood looked like the general of a defeated army, calling till he became hoarse, and running till he was out of breath, vainly trying thus to stop the confusion, and to bring the stragglers back in better order. Meantime, Harry and Peter were far before the rest, though Edward Ashford was following hard after them in desperate haste, as if he still hoped to overtake their steps. Suddenly, however, a loud cry of distress was overheard, and when Harry looked up he saw so very alarming a sight that he could scarcely believe his eyes, and almost screamed out himself with the fright it gave him, while he seemed to forget in a moment the race, Peter Grey, and the prodigious cake. Laura had been very anxious not to trouble Harry with taking care of her in coming down the bank again, for she saw that during all this fun about the cake, he perfectly forgot that she was not accustomed every day to such a scramble on the hills, and would have required some help. After looking down every side of the descent, and thinking that each appeared steeper than another, while they all made her equally giddy, Laura determined to venture on a part of the hill which seemed rather less precipitous than the rest. But it completely cheated her, being the most difficult and dangerous part of Arthur's Seat. The slope became steeper and steeper at every step, but Laura always tried to hope her path might grow better, till at last she reached a place where it was impossible to stop herself. Down she went, down, down, whether she would or not, screaming and sliding on a long slippery bank, till she reached the very edge of a dangerous precipice, which appeared higher than the side of a room. Laura then grappled hold of some stones and grass, calling loudly for help, while scarcely able to keep from falling into the deep ravine, which probably would have killed her. Her screams were echoed all over the hill, when Harry, seeing her frightful situation, clambered up the bank faster than any lamplighter, and immediately flew to Laura's assistance, who was now really hanging over the chasm, quite unable to help herself. At last he reached the place where poor Laura lay, and seized hold of her by the frock, but for some time it seemed an equal chance whether she dragged him into the hole, or he pulled her away from it. Luckily, however, by a great effort, Harry succeeded in delivering Laura, whom he placed upon a secure situation, and then, having waited patiently till she recovered from the fright, he led her carefully and kindly down to the bottom of Arthur's Seat. Now all the boys had already got there, and a violent dispute was going on about which of them first reached the cake. Peter Grey had pushed down Edward Ashford, who caught hold of Robert Fordyce, and they all three rolled to the bottom together, so that nobody could tell which had won the race, while Mr. Harwood labored in vain to convince him that the cake belonged neither to the one nor the other, being his own property. They all laughed at Harry for being distanced and arriving last, while Mr. Harwood watched him coming down, and was pleased to observe how carefully he attended to Laura, though still, being annoyed at the riot and confusion which Harry had occasioned, he determined to appear exceedingly angry, and put on a very terrible voice, saying, "Hollo, young gentlemen! What shall I do to you for beginning this uproar? As the old proverb says, one fool makes many. How dare you roll my fine cake down the hill in this way, and send everybody rolling after it? Look me in the face, and say you are ashamed of yourself." Harry looked at Mr. Harwood, and Mr. Harwood looked at Harry. They both tried to seem very grave and serious, but somehow Harry's eyes glittered very brightly, and 2 little dimples might be seen in his cheeks. Mr. Harwood also had his eyebrows gathered into a terrible frown, but still his eyes were likewise sparkling, and his mouth seemed to be pursed up in a most comical manner. After staring at each other for several minutes, both Mr. Harwood and Harry burst into a prodigious fit of laughing, and nobody could tell which began first or laughed longest. "Master Graham, you must send a new frock to every little girl of the party, and a suit of clothes to each of the boys for having caused theirs to be all destroyed. I really meant to punish you severely for beginning such a riot, but something has made me change my mind. In almost every moment of our lives, we either act amiably or unamiably, and I observed you treat Miss Laura so kindly and properly all this morning, that I shall say not another word about the prodigious cake." End of Chapter 4. Recording by Kieran Metz. Chapter 5 of Holiday House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kieran Metz, Columbus, Ohio. Holiday House by Catherine Sinclair. Chapter 5. The Last Clean Frock. "For," said she, "in spite of what Grandmama taught her, I'm really remarkably fond of the water." She splashed and she dashed, and she turned herself round, and heartily wished herself safe on the ground. Once upon a time, Harry and Laura had got into so many scrapes that there seemed really no end to their misconduct. They generally forgot to learn any lessons, often tore their books, drew pictures on their slates instead of calculating sums, and made the pages of their copybooks into boats. Besides which, Mrs. Crabtree caught them one day when a party of officers dined at Lady Harriet's, with 2 of the captain's sword belts buckled round their waists, and cocked hats upon their heads, while they beat the crown of a gentleman's hat with a walking stick to sound like a drum. Still, it seemed impossible to make Uncle David feel sufficiently angry at them, though Mrs. Crabtree did all she could to put him in a passion, by telling the very worst. But he made 50 excuses a minute, as if he had been the naughty person himself instead of Harry or Laura, and above all, he said that they both seemed so exceedingly penitent when he explained their delinquencies, and they were both so ready to tell upon themselves, and to take all the blame of whatever mischief might be done, that he was determined to shut his eyes and say nothing, unless they did something purposely wrong. One night, when Mrs. Crabtree had gone out, Major Graham felt quite surprised on his return home from a late dinner party to find Laura and Harry still out of bed. They were sitting in his library when he entered, both looking so tired and miserable that he could not imagine what had happened. But Harry lost no time in confessing that he and Laura feared they had done some dreadful mischief, so they could not sleep without asking pardon, and mentioning whose fault it was, that the maids might not be unjustly blamed. "Well, you little imps of mischief, what have I to scold you for now?" asked Uncle David, not looking particularly angry. Is it something that I shall be obliged to take the trouble of punishing you for? We ought to live in the Highlands, where there are whole forests of birch ready for use. Why are your ears like a bell rope, Harry? Because they seem made to be pulled. Now, go on with your story. What is the matter?" "We were playing about the room, Uncle David, and Laura lost her ball, so she crept under that big table, which has only one large leg. There is a brass button below, so we were trying if it would come off, when all on a sudden the table fell quite to one side, as you see it now, tumbling down those prodigious books and tin boxes on the floor. I cannot think how this fine new table could be so easily broken, but whenever we even look at anything, it seems to break." "Yes, Harry, you remind me of Meddlesome Matty in the nursery rhymes. Sometimes she'd lift the teapot lid to peep at what was in it, or tilt the kettle if you did but turn your back a minute. In vain you told her not to touch, her trick of meddling grew so much. You have scarcely left my poor table a leg to stand on. How am I ever to get it mended?" "Perhaps the carpenter could do it tomorrow?" "Or perhaps Uncle David could do it at this moment," said Major Graham, raising the fallen side with a sudden jerk, when Harry and Laura heard a sound under the table like the locking of a door, after which the whole affair was rectified. "Did I ever!" exclaimed Harry, staring with astonishment. "So we have suffered all our fright for nothing, and the table was not really broken? I shall always run to you, Uncle David, when we are in a scrape, for you are sure to get us off." "Do not reckon too certainly on that, Master Harry. It is easier to get into one than to get out of it, any day. But I am not so seriously angry at the sort of scrapes Laura and you get into, because you would not willingly and deliberately do wrong. If any children commit a mean action, or get into a passion, or quarrel with each other, or omit saying their prayers and reading their Bibles, or tell a lie, or take what does not belong to them, then it might be seen how extremely angry I could be. But while you continue merely thoughtless and forgetful, I mean to have patience a little longer before turning into a cross old uncle with a pair of taws." Harry sprung upon Uncle David's knee, quite delighted to hear him speak so very kindly, and Laura was soon installed in her usual place there also, listening to all that was said, and laughing at his jokes. "As Mrs. Crabtree says," continued Major Graham, "we cannot put an old head on young shoulders, and it would certainly look very odd if you could." So Uncle David took out his pencil and drew a funny picture of a cross old wrinkled face upon young shoulders like Laura's, and after they had all laughed at it together for about 5 minutes, he sent the children both to bed, quite merry and cheerful. A long time elapsed afterwards without anything going wrong, and it was quite pleasant to see such learning of lessons, such attention to rules, and such obedience to Mrs. Crabtree as went on in the nursery during several weeks. At last, one day, when Lady Harriet and Major Graham were preparing to set off on a journey, and to pay a short visit at Holiday House, Laura and Harry observed a great deal of whispering and talking in a corner of the room, but they could not exactly discover what it was all about, till Major Graham said very earnestly, "I think we might surely take Laura with us." "Yes," answered Lady Harriet, "both the children have been invited, and are behaving wonderfully well of late. But Lord Rockville has such a dislike to noise, that I dare not venture to take more than one at a time. Poor Laura has a very severe cough, so she may be recovered by change of air. As for Harry, he is quite well, and therefore he can stay at home." Now Harry thought it very hard that he was to be left at home, merely because he felt quite well, so he immediately wished to be very ill indeed, that he might have some chance of going to Holiday House. But then he did not exactly know how to set about it. At all events, Harry determined to catch a cold like Laura's without delay. He would not, for the whole world, have pretended to suffer from a cough if he really had none, because Uncle David had often explained that making any one believe an untruth was the same as telling a lie. But he thought there might be no harm in really getting such a terrible cold that nothing could possibly cure it except change of air, and a trip to Holiday House with Laura. Accordingly, Harry tried to remember everything that Mrs. Crabtree had forbid him to do for fear of catching cold. He sprinkled water over his shirt collar in the morning before dressing, that it might be damp, He ran violently up and down stairs to put himself in a heat, after which he sat between the open window and door till he felt perfectly chilled, and when going to bed at night, he washed his hair in cold water without drying it. Still, all was in vain. Harry had formerly caught cold 100 times when he did not want one, but now such a thing was not to be had for love or money. Nothing seemed to give him the very slightest attempt at a cough, and when the day at last arrived for Lady Harriet to begin her journey, Harry still felt himself most provokingly well. Not so much as a finger ached. His cheeks were as blooming as roses, his voice as clear as a bell, and when Uncle David accidentally said to him in the morning, "How do you do?" Harry was obliged, very much against his will, to answer, "Quite well, I thank you." In the meantime, Laura would have felt too happy if Harry could only have gone with her. And even as it was, being impatient for the happy day to arrive, she hurried to bed an hour earlier than usual the night before, to make the time of setting out appear nearer, and she could scarcely sleep or eat for thinking of Holiday House, and planning all that was to be done there. "It is pleasant to see so joyous a face," said Major Graham. "I almost envy you, Laura, for being so happy." "Oh, I quite envy myself, but I shall write a long letter every day to poor Harry, telling him all the news and all my adventures."
"Nonsense, Miss Laura! Wait till you come home," said Mrs. Crabtree. "Who do you think is going to pay postage for so many foolish letters?"
"I shall," answered Harry. "I have got 6 pence and 2 pence and halfpenny, so I shall buy every one of Laura's letters from the postman, and write her an answer immediately afterwards. She will like to hear, Mrs. Crabtree, how very kind you are going to be, when I am left by myself here. Perhaps you will play at 9-pins with me, and Laura can lend you her skipping rope." "You might as well offer Uncle David a hobby horse," said Frank, laughingly, throwing his satchel over his shoulders. "No, Harry, you shall belong to me now. Grandmama says you may go every day to my playground, where all the schoolboys assemble, and you can have plenty of fun till Laura comes back. We shall jump over the moon every morning for joy." Harry brightened up amazingly, thinking he had never heard such good news before, as it was a grand piece of promotion to play with real big schoolboys, so he became quite reconciled to Laura's going away for a short time without him, and when the hour came for taking leave, instead of tears being shed on either side, it would have been difficult to say, as they kissed each other and said a joyous good-bye, which face looked the most delighted. All Laura's clothes had been packed the night before, in a large chaise seat, which was now put into the carriage along with herself, and everything seemed ready for departure, when Lady Harriet's maid was suddenly taken so very ill as to be quite unfit for travelling. Therefore she was left behind, and a doctor sent for to attend her, while Lady Harriet said she would trust to the maids at Holiday House for waiting upon herself and Laura. It is seldom that so happy a face is seen in this world, as Laura wore during the whole journey. It perfectly sparkled and glittered with delight, while she was so constantly on a broad grin laughing, that Major Graham said he feared her mouth would grow an inch wider on the occasion. "You will tire of sitting so idle. It is a pity we did not think of bringing a few lesson books in the carriage to amuse you, Laura," said the Major slyly. "A piece of needlework might have beguiled the way. I once knew an industrious lady who made a ball dress for herself in the carriage during a journey." "How very stupid of her to miss seeing all the pretty trees, and cottages, and farmhouses! I do like to watch the little curly-headed dirty children playing on the road, with brown faces and hair bleached white in the sun, and the women hanging out their clothes on the hedges to dry, and the blacksmith shoeing horses, and the ducks swimming in the gutters, and the pigs thrusting their noses out of the sty, and the old women knitting stockings, and the workmen sitting on a wall to eat their dinners. It all looks so pretty and so pleasant." "What a picture of rural felicity! You ought to be a poet or a painter, Laura." "But I believe poets always call this a miserable world, and I think it is the happiest place I have ever been in, Uncle David. Such fun during the holidays! I should go wild altogether if Mrs. Crabtree were not rather cross sometimes." "Or very cross always," thought Major Graham. "But here we are, Laura, near our journey's end. Allow me to introduce you to Holiday House. Why, you are staring at it like a dog looking at a piece of cold beef. My dear girl, if you open your eyes so wide, you will never be able to shut them again." Holiday House was not one of those prodigious places, too grand to be pleasant, with the garden a mile off in one direction, and the farm a mile off in another, and the drawing room a mile off from the dining room. But it was a very cheerful modern mansion, with rooms enough to hold as many people as anyone could desire to see at once, all very comfortably furnished. A lively dashing river streamed past the windows, a small park sprinkled with sheep and shaded by fine trees surrounded the house, and beyond were beautiful gardens filled with a superabundance of the gayest and sweetest common flowers. Roses, carnations, wallflowers, hollyhocks, dahlias, lilies, and violets were assembled there in such crowds that Laura might have plucked nosegays all day without making any visible difference. And she was also made free of the gooseberry bushes and cherry trees, with leave to gather, if she pleased, more than she could eat. Every morning Laura entered the breakfast room with cheeks like the roses she carried, bringing little bouquets for all the ladies, which she had started out of bed early in order to gather, and her great delight was to see them worn and admired all the forenoon, while she was complimented on the taste with which they had been selected and arranged. She filled every ornamental jar, basin, and teacup in the drawing room with groups of roses, and would have been the terror of any gardener but the one at Holiday House, who liked to see his flowers so much admired, and was not keeping up any for a horticultural show. Laura's chief delight, however, was in the dairy, which seemed the most beautiful thing she had ever beheld, being built of rough transparent spar, which looked exactly like crystal, and reminded her of the ice palace built by the Empress of Russia. The windows were of painted glass, the walls and shelves were of Dutch tiles, and in the centre rose a beautiful jet d'eau of clear bright water. Laura thought it looked like something built for the fairies, but within she saw a most substantial room, the floor and tables in which were so completely covered with cheeses that they looked like some old mosaic pavement. Here the good-natured dairymaid showed Laura how to make cheese, and afterwards manufactured a very small one about the size of a soup plate, entirely for the young lady herself, which she promised to take home after her visit was over. And a little churn was also filled full of cream, which Laura one morning churned into butter, and breakfasted upon, after having first practised printing it into a variety of shapes. It was altered about 20 times, from a swan into a cow, and from a cow into a rose, and from a rose back to a swan again, before she could be persuaded to leave off her amusement. Laura continued to become more and more delighted with Holiday House, and she one day skipped about Lady Harriet's room, saying, "Oh, I am too happy! I scarcely know what to do with so much happiness. How delightful it would be to stay here all my life, and never go to bed, nor say any more lessons as long as I live." "What a useless, stupid girl you would soon become," observed Lady Harriet. "Do you think, Laura, that lessons were invented for no other purpose but to torment little children?" "No, grandmama, not exactly. They are of use also to keep us quiet." "Come here, little madam, and listen to me. I shall soon be very old, Laura, and not able to read my Bible, even with spectacles. For, as the Scriptures told us, in that affecting description of old age which I read to you yesterday, the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened. What then do you think I can do? Because the Bible now is my best comfort, which I shall need more and more every day, to tell me all about the eternal world where I am going, and to show me the way." "Grandmama, you promised long ago to let me attend on you when you grow old and blind. I shall be very careful, and very, very, very kind. I almost wish you were old and blind now, to let you feel how much I love you, and how anxious I am to be as good to you as you have always been to me. We shall read the Bible together every morning, and as often afterwards as you please." "Thank you, my dear child, but you must take the trouble of learning to read well, or we shall be sadly puzzled with the difficult words. A friend of mine once had nobody that could read to her when she was ill but the maid, who bargained that she might leave out every word above 1 syllable long, because they were too hard for her, and you could hardly help laughing at the nonsense it sometimes made. But I hope you will manage better." "Oh, certainly, grandmama. I can spell Kronenhottenthologos, and all the other 5-cornered words in my reading made easy already. Besides that, my dear Laura, unless you learn to look over my bills, I may be sadly cheated by servants and shopkeepers. You must positively study to find out how many cherries make 5. Ah, Grandmamma, nobody knows better than I do that 2 and 2 make 4. I shall soon be quite able to keep your accounts. Very well, but you have not yet heard half the trouble I mean to give you. I am remarkably fond of music, and shall probably at last be obliged to hire every old fiddler as he passes in the street, by giving him 6 in order to enjoy some of my favourite tunes. No, Grandmamma, you shall hear them all from me. I can play Malbrook and Auld Robin Grey already, and Frank says that if I practise 2 hours every day for 10 years, I shall become a very tolerable player, fit for you and Uncle David to hear without being disagreeable. Then that will be more than 7,000 hours of musical lessons which you have yet to endure, Laura. There are many more things of still greater importance to learn also, if you wish to be any better than a musical snuff-box. For instance, when visitors come to see me, they are often from France or Italy. But perhaps you will not mind sitting in the room as if you were deaf and dumb, gazing at those foreigners while they gaze at you, without understanding a syllable they say, and causing them to feel strange and uncomfortable as long as they remain in the house. No, I would not for the world seem so unkind and uncivil. Pray, let me learn plenty of languages. Very well, but if you study no geography, what ridiculous blunders will you be falling into, asking the Italians about their native town, Madrid, and the Americans if they were born at Petersburg? You will be fancying that travellers go by steamboats to Moscow, and travel in a day from Paris through Stockholm to Naples. How ashamed I should be of such mistakes! And so should I, Grandmamma, still more than you, for it would be quite a disgrace. Do you remember, Laura, your Uncle David laughing, when he last went to live at Leamington, about poor Mrs. Marmalade coming upstairs to say, she did not wish to be troublesome, but should feel greatly obliged if he would call at Portsmouth occasionally to see her son Thomas? And when Captain Armylist's regiment was ordered last winter to the village of Bathgate near this, he told me they were to march in the course of that morning, all the way to Baghdad. Yes, Grandmamma, and Mrs. Crabtree said some weeks ago that if her brother went to Van Diemen's Land, she thought he would, of course, in passing, take a look at Jerusalem. And Frank was amused lately to hear Peter Grey maintain that Gulliver was as great a man as Columbus, because he discovered Lilliput. Quite like him, for I heard Peter ask one day lately what side Bonaparte was on at the Battle of Leipzig. We must include a little history, I think, Laura, in our list of studies, or you will fancy that Lord Nelson fought at the Battle of Blenheim, and that Henry VIII cut off Queen Mary's head. Not quite so bad as that, Grandmamma. I seem to have known all about Lord Nelson and Queen Mary ever since I was a baby in long frocks. You have shown me, however, that it would be very foolish not to feel anxious for lessons, especially when they are to make me a fit companion for you at last. Yes, Laura, and not only for me, but for many whose conversation will entertain and improve you more than any books. The most delightful accomplishment that a young person can cultivate is that of conversing agreeably, and it is less attended to in education than any other. You cannot take a harp or piano about with you, but our minds and tongues are always portable and accompany us wherever we go. If you wish to be loved by others, and to do good to your associates as well as to entertain them, take every opportunity of conversing with those who are either amiable or agreeable, not only attending to their opinions, but also endeavouring to gain the habit of expressing your own thoughts with ease and fluency. And then rest assured that if the gift of conversation be rightly exercised, it is the most desirable of all, as no teaching can have greater influence in leading people to think and act aright than the incidental remarks of an enlightened Christian, freely and unaffectedly talking to his intimate friends. Well, Grandmamma, the moral of all this is that I shall become busier than anybody ever was before when we get home. But in the meantime I may take a good dose of idleness now at Holiday House, to prepare me for settling to very hard labour afterwards, said Laura, hastily tying on her bonnet. I wonder if I shall ever be as merry and happy again. Most unfortunately, All the time of Laura's visit at Holiday House, she had been, as usual, extremely heedless in taking no care whatever of her clothes. Consequently, her blue merino frock had been cruelly torn, her green silk dress became frightfully soiled, 4 white frocks were utterly ruined, her Swiss muslin seemed a perfect objet, and her pink gingham was both torn and discoloured. Regularly every evening, Lady Harriet told her to take better care, or she would be a bankrupt in frocks altogether. But whatever her grandmama said on that subject, the moment she was out of sight, it went out of mind, till another dress had shared the same deplorable fate. At last, one morning, as soon as Laura got up, Lady Harriet gravely led her towards a large table, on which all the ill-used frocks had been laid out in a row, and a most dismal sight they were. Such a collection of stains and fractures was probably never seen before. A beggar would scarcely have thanked her for her blue merino, and the green silk frock looked like the tattered cover of a worn-out umbrella. "Laura," said Lady Harriet, "in Switzerland a lady's wardrobe descends to many generations, but nobody will envy your successor. One might fancy that a wild beast had torn you to pieces every day. I wonder what an old clothesman would give us for your whole baggage. It is only fit for being used as rags in a paper manufactory." Poor Laura's face became perfectly pink when she saw the destruction that a very short time had occasioned, and she looked from one tattered garment to another in melancholy silence, thinking how lately they had all been fresh and beautiful, but now not a vestige of their former splendour remained. At last her grandmama broke the awful silence by saying, "My dear girl, I have warned you very often lately that we are not at home where your frocks could be washed and mended as soon as they were spoiled. But without considering this, you have, every day, destroyed several, so now the maid finds, on examining your drawers, that there is only one clean frock remaining." Laura looked gravely at the last clean frock, and wondered much what her grandmama would say next. "I do not wish to make a prisoner of you at home during this very fine weather, yet in 5 minutes after leaving the house, you will, of course, become unfit to be seen, which I should very much regret, as a number of fine people are coming to dinner whom you would like to see. The great General Courtney and all his aides de camp intend to be here on their way from a review, besides many officers and ladies who know your papa very well, and wish to see my little granddaughter. But I would not on any account allow you to appear before them looking like a perfect tatterdemalion, as you too often do. They would suppose you had been drawn backwards through a hedge. Now my plan is, that you shall wear this old pink gingham for romping all morning in the garden, and dress in your last clean frock for dinner. But remember to keep out of sight till then. Remain within the garden walls, as none of the company will be walking there. But be sure to avoid the terrace and shrubberies till you are made tidy, for I shall be both angry and mortified if your papa's friends see you for the first time looking like rag fair." Laura promised to remember her grandmama's injunctions, and to remain invisible all morning. So off she set to the garden, singing and skipping with joy, as she ran towards her pleasant hiding place, planning 20 ways in which the day might be delightfully spent alone. Before long she had strung a long necklace of daisies. She had put many bright leaves in a book to dry. She had made a large ball of cowslips to toss in the air. She had watered the hyacinths with a watering pot till they were nearly washed away. She had plucked more roses than could possibly be carried, and ate as many gooseberries and cherries as it was convenient to swallow. But still there were several hours remaining to be enjoyed, and nothing very particular that Laura could think of to do. Meantime, the miserable pink frock was torn worse than ever, and seemed to be made of nothing but holes, for every gooseberry bush in the garden had got a share of it. Laura wished pink gingham frocks had never been invented, and wondered why nothing stronger could be made. Having become perfectly tired of the garden, she now wished herself anywhere else in the world, and thought she was no better off, confined in this way within 4 walls, than a canary bird in a cage. "I should like so much to go, if it were only for 5 minutes, on the terrace," she said to herself. "How much pleasanter it is than this! Grandmama did not care where I went, provided nobody saw me. I may at least take a peep to see if anyone is there." Laura now cautiously opened the garden door and put her head out, intending only to look for a moment. But the moment grew longer and longer, till it stretched into 10 minutes. What crowds of fine people are walking about on the terrace, thought she. It looks as gay as a fair. Who can that officer be in a red coat and cocked hat with white feathers? Probably General Courtney, paying attention to Lady Rockville. There is a lady in a blue cloak and blue flowers. How very pretty! Everybody is so exceedingly smart. And I see some little boys, too. Grandmamma never told me any children were coming. I wonder how old they are, and if they will play with me in the evening. It would be very amusing to venture a little nearer and get a better glimpse of them all. If Laura's wishes pointed one way, and her duty pointed the other, it was a very sad thing how often she forgot to pause and consider which she ought to follow. And on this occasion, as usual, she took the naughty side of the question, and prepared to indulge her curiosity, though very anxious that nothing might happen to displease her grandmamma. She observed at some distance on the terrace a remarkably large, thick holly bush, near which the great procession of company would probably pass before long. Therefore, hoping nobody could possibly see her there, she stole hastily out of the garden and concealed herself behind it. But when children do wrong, in hopes of not being found out, they generally find themselves mistaken, as Laura soon discovered to her cost. It is very lucky, however, for the culprits, when they are detected, that they may learn never to behave so foolishly again. Because the greatest misfortune that can happen to a child is not to be found out and punished when he does wrong. A few minutes after Laura had taken her station behind the holly bush, crowds of ladies and officers came strolling along, so very near her hiding place that she saw them all distinctly, and felt excessively amused and delighted at first to be perched like a bird in a tree watching this grand party, while nobody saw her nor guessed that she was there. Presently, however, Laura became sadly frightened when an officer in a scarlet coat happened to look toward the holly bush and exclaimed with some surprise, "There is surely something very odd about that plant. I see large pink spots between the leaves." "Oh no, Captain Digby, you are quite mistaken," answered one of the ladies, dressed in a bright yellow bonnet and green pelisse. "I see nothing particular there, only a common ugly bush of holly. I wonder you ever thought of noticing it." "But, Miss Percival, there certainly is something very curious behind. I would bet 5 to 1 there is," replied Captain Digby, stepping up close to the holly bush and peeping over. "What have we here? A ragged little girl, I do believe, in a pink frock." Poor Laura was now in a terrible scrape. She started up immediately to run away. Probably she never ran so fast in her life before, but Captain Digby was a person who enjoyed a joke, so he called out, "Tally-ho! A race for 1,000 pounds!" Off set the captain, and away flew Laura. At any other time she would have thought it capital fun, but now she was frightened out of her wits, and tore away at the very top of her speed. The whole party of ladies and gentlemen stood laughing and applauding to see how fast they both cleared the ground, while Laura, seeing the garden gate still wide open, hoped she might be able to dart in and close it, but alas! When she arrived within 4 steps of the threshold, feeling almost certain of escape, Captain Digby seized hold of her pink frock behind. It instantly began tearing, so she had great hopes of leaving the piece in his hand and getting off, but he was too clever for that, as he grasped hold of her long sash, which was floating far out behind, and led Laura a prisoner before the whole company. When Lady Harriet discovered that this was really Laura advancing, her head hanging down, her hair streaming about her ears, and her face like a full moon, she could scarcely credit her own eyes, and held her hands up with astonishment, while Uncle David shrugged his shoulders till they almost met over his head. But not a word was said on either side until they got home, when Lady Harriet at last broke the awful silence by saying, "My dear girl, you must of course be severely punished for this act of disobedience, and it is not so much on account of feeling angry at your misconduct that I mean to correct you, but because I love you, and wish to make you behave better in future. Parents are appointed by God to govern their children as He governs us, not carelessly indulging their faults, but wisely correcting them, for we are told that our great Father in heaven chastens those whom he loves, and only afflicts us for great and wise purposes. I have suffered many sorrows in the world, but they always made me better in the end, and whatever discipline you meet with from me, or from that great being who loves you still more than I do, let it teach you to consider your ways, to repent of your willfulness, and to pray that you may be enabled to act more properly in future." "Yes, grandmamma," replied Laura, with tears in her eyes, "I am quite willing to be punished, for it was very wrong indeed to make you so vexed and ashamed by disobeying your orders." "Then here is a long task which you must study before dinner, as a penalty for trespassing bounds. It is a beautiful poem on the death of Sir John Moore, which every schoolgirl can repeat, but being rather long, you will scarcely have time to learn it perfectly before coming down to dessert. Therefore, that you may be quite ready, I shall ring now for Lady Rockville's maid, and have you washed and dressed immediately. Remember this is your last clean frock, and be sure not to spoil it." When Laura chose to pay attention, she could learn her lessons wonderfully fast, and her eyes seemed nailed to the book for some time after Lady Harriet went away, till at last she could repeat the whole poem perfectly well. It was neither slowly nor sadly that Laura laid down her book, after practising it all in a sort of jig time, till she could rattle over the poem like a railroad. And she walked to the window, still murmuring the verses to herself with prodigious glee, and giving little thought to their melancholy subject. A variety of plans suggested themselves to her mind for amusing herself within doors, as she had been forbidden to venture out, and she lost no time in executing them. First, she tried on all her grandmamma's caps at a looking-glass, none of which were improved by being crushed and tumbled in such a way. Then she quarrelled with Lady Rockville's beautiful cockatoo till it bit her finger violently, and after that she teased the old cat till it scratched her. But all these diversions were not sufficiently entertaining, so Laura began to grow rather tired, till at last she went to gaze out at the portico of Holiday House, being perfectly determined on no account whatever to go one single step farther. Here Laura saw many things which entertained her extremely, for she had scarcely ever seen more of the country than was to be enjoyed with Mrs. Crabtree in Charlotte Square. The punctual crows were all returning home at their usual hour for the evening, and looked like a black shower over her head, while hundreds of them seemed trying to make a concert at once. The robins hopped close to her feet, evidently accustomed to be fed. A tame pheasant, as fat as a London alderman, came up the steps to keep her company, and the peacock, spreading his tail and strutting about, looked the very picture of silly pride and vanity. Laura admired and enjoyed all this extremely, and crumbled down nearly a loaf of bread, which she scattered on the ground in order to be popular among her visitors, who took all they could get from her, and quarrelled among themselves about it very much as boys and girls would perhaps have done in the same circumstances. It happened at this moment that a large flock of geese crossed the park on their way towards the river, stalking along in a slow, majestic manner with their heads high in the air. Laura observed them at a distance, and thought they were the prettiest creatures in the world, with their pure white feathers and yellow stockings. So she wondered what kind of birds these were, having never seen a goose before, except when roasted for dinner, though indeed she was a sad goose herself, as will very soon be told. "How I should like to examine those large, white, beautiful birds a little nearer," thought Laura to herself. "I wonder if they could swim or fly. Oh, how perfect they would look, floating like water lilies on the river! And then I might take a bit of bread to throw in, and they would all rush after it." Laura, as usual, did not wait to reflect what her grandmamma might be likely to think. Indeed, it is to be feared Laura forgot at the moment that she had a grandmamma at all, for her mind was never large enough to hold more than one thing at a time, and now it was entirely filled with the flock of geese. She instantly set off in pursuit of them, and began chasing the whole party across the park, making all sorts of dreadful noises in hopes they might fly. But on the contrary, they held up their heads, as if she had been a dancing master, and marched slowly on, cackling loudly to each other, and evidently getting extremely angry. Laura was now quite close to her new acquaintances, and even threw a pebble to hurry them forward, when suddenly an old gander stopped and turned round in a terrible rage. The whole flock of geese then did the same, after which they flew towards Laura with their bills wide open, hissing furiously and stretching out their long necks in an angry, menacing way, as if they wished to tear her in pieces. Poor Laura became frightened out of any wits she ever had, and ran off, with all the geese after her. Anybody must have laughed into fits could they have heard what a triumphant cackle the geese set up, and had they seen how fast she flew away. If Laura had borrowed a pair of wings from her pursuers, she could scarcely have got more quickly on. In the hurry of escaping, she always looked back to see if the enemy followed, and scarcely observed which way she ran herself, till suddenly her foot stumbled over a large stone, and she fell headlong into the river. Oh, what a scream Laura gave! It terrified even the old gander himself, and sent the whole flock of geese marching off, nearly as fast as they had come. But Laura's cries also reached, at a great distance, the ears of somebody who she would have been very sorry to think had heard them. Lady Harriet and all her friends at Holiday House were taking a delightful walk under some fine old fir trees on the banks of the river, admiring the beautiful scenery, while Miss Percival was admiring nothing but her own fine pocket-handkerchief, which had cost 10 guineas, being worked with her name, trimmed with lace, and perfumed with eau de cologne, and Captain Digby was admiring his own scarlet uniform reflected in the bright clear water, and varying his employment occasionally by throwing pebbles into the stream to see how far they would go. Suddenly, however, he stopped with a look of surprise and alarm, saying, "What noise can that be? A loud scream in the water!" "Oh dear no, it was only one of those horrid peacocks," answered Miss Percival, waving her fine pocket-handkerchief. "They're the most disagreeable, noisy creatures in the world. If mamma ever keeps one, I shall get him a singing master, or put a muzzle on his mouth." "But surely there is something splashing in the river at a great distance. Do you not see that? What can it be?" "Nothing at all, depend upon it. I could bet the value of my pocket-handkerchief, 10 guineas, that it is nothing. Officers who live constantly in barracks are so unaccustomed to the country, that they seem to expect something wonderful shall happen every minute. That is probably a salmon or a minnow." "I am determined, however, to see. If you are quite sure this is a salmon, will you promise to eat for your dinner whatever we find, provided I can catch it?" "Certainly, unless you catch a whale. Oh, I have dropped my pocket-handkerchief. Pray, pick it up." Captain Digby did so, but without waiting to examine the pattern. He instantly ran forward, and to his own very great astonishment, saw Laura up to her knees in the river, trying to scramble out, while her face was white with terror, and her limbs trembled with cold, like a poodle dog newly washed. "Why, here you are again! The very same little girl that I caught in the morning!" cried he, laughing heartily, while he carefully pulled Laura towards the bank, though by doing so he splashed his beautiful uniform most distressingly. "We have had a complete game at Bo Peep to-day, my friend, but here comes a lady who has promised to eat you up, therefore I shall have no more trouble." Laura would have consented to be eaten up with pleasure, rather than encounter Lady Harriet's eye, who really did not recognize her for the first minute, as no one can suppose what a figure she appeared. The last clean frock had been covered entirely over with mud, her hair was dripping with water, and her new yellow sash might be any colour in the world. Laura felt so completely ashamed she could not look up from the ground, and so sorry she could not speak, while hot tears mingled themselves with the cold water which trickled down her face. "What is the matter? Who is this?" cried Lady Harriet, hurrying up to the place where they stood. "Laura! Impossible!" "Let me put on a pair of spectacles, for I cannot believe my eyes without them," said Major Graham. "Ah, sure enough it is Laura, and such a looking Laura as I never saw before. You must have had a nice cold bath." "I have heard," continued Lady Harriet, "that naughty people are often ducked in the water as a punishment, and in that respect I am sure Laura deserves what she has got, and a great deal more." "She reminds me," observed Captain Digby, "of the Chinese bird, which has no legs, so it constantly flies about from place to place, never a moment at rest." "Follow me, Laura, that I may hear whether you have anything to say for yourself on this occasion." It is scarcely possible that there can be any excuse, but nobody should be condemned unheard. When Laura had been put into dry clothes, she told her whole history, and entreated Lady Harriet to hear how perfectly she had first learned her task, before venturing to stir out of the room. Upon which her grandmama consented, and amidst tears and sobs, the monody on Sir John Moore was repeated without a single mistake. Lady Rockville then came in to entreat that, as this was the last day of the visit to Holiday House, Laura might be forgiven and permitted to appear at dessert, as all the company were anxious to see her, and particularly Captain Digby, who regretted that he had been the means at first of getting her into a scrape. "Indeed, my dear Lady Rockville, I might perhaps have agreed to your wishes," answered Lady Harriet, "particularly as Laura seems sincerely sorry, and did not premeditate her disobedience. But she actually has not a tolerable frock to appear in now." "I must lend her one of my velvet dresses to destroy next," said Lady Rockville, smiling. "Uncle David's mackintosh cloak would be the fittest thing for her to wear," replied Lady Harriet, rising to leave the room. "Laura, you must learn a double task now. Here it is, and at Lady Rockville's request I excuse you this once, though I am sorry for that, for very sufficient reasons. We cannot see you at dessert, which otherwise I would have been most happy to do." Laura sat down and cried during a quarter of an hour after Lady Harriet had gone to dinner. She felt sorry for having behaved ill, and sorry to have vexed her good grandmama, and sorry not to see all the fine party at dessert, and sorry to think that next day she must leave Holiday House, and sorry, last of all, to consider what Mrs. Crabtree would say when all her ruined frocks were brought home. In short, poor Laura felt perfectly overwhelmed with the greatness and variety of her griefs, and scarcely believed that any one in the world was ever more miserable than herself. Her eyes were fixed on her task, while her thoughts were wandering 50 miles away from it, when a housemaid, who had frequently attended upon Laura during her visit, accidentally entered the room, and seemed much surprised, as well as concerned, to find the young lady in such a way, for her sobbing could be heard in the next room. It was quite a relief to see any one, so Laura told over again all the sad adventures of the day, without attempting to conceal how naughty she had been, and most attentively was her narrative listened to till the very end. "You see, miss," observed Nelly, "when people doesn't behave well, they must expect to be punished." "So they should," sobbed Laura, "and I dare say it will make me better. I would not pass such a miserable day as this again for the world, but I deserve to be more punished than I am." "That's right, miss," replied Nelly, pleased to see the good effect of her admonitions. "Punishment is as sure to do us good when we are naughty, as physic when we are ill. But now you'll go down to dessert and forget it all." "No, grandmama would have allowed me, and Lady Rockville and everybody was so very kind about inviting me down, but my last clean frock is quite unfit to be seen, so I have none to put on. Oh dear, what 1,000,000,000 of pities!" "Is that all, miss? Then dry your eyes, and I can wash the frock in 10 minutes. Give it to me, and learn your lesson, so as to be ready when I come back." Laura sprung off her seat with joy at this proposal, and ran, or rather flew, to fetch her miserable object of a frock, which Nelly crumpled under her arm, and walked away with in such haste that she was evidently determined to return very soon, while Laura took her good advice, and sat down to learn her task, though she could hardly look at the book during 2 minutes at a time, she watched so impatiently for her benefactress from the laundry. At length the door flew open, and in walked Nelly, whose face looked as red and hot as a beefsteak, but in her hand she carried a basket, on which was laid out in great state the very cleanest frock that ever was seen. It perfectly smelled of soap and water, starch and hot irons, and seemed still almost smoking from the laundry, while Laura looked at it with such delight and admiration, it might have been supposed she never saw a clean frock before. When Lady Harriet was sitting after dinner that day, sipping her wine, and thinking about nothing very particular, she became surprised to feel somebody gently twitching her sleeve to attract notice. Turning instantly round to ascertain what was the matter, and who it could be, what was her astonishment to see Laura at her elbow, looking rather shy and frightened. "How did you get here, child?" exclaimed Lady Harriet in accents of amazement, though almost laughing. "Am I never to see the last of you to-day? Where did you get that frock? It must have dropped down from the clouds. Or did some good fairy give you a new one?" "That good fairy was Nellie the housemaid," whispered Laura. "She first tossed my frock into a washing tub, and then at the great kitchen fire she toasted it, and buttered it, I hope," added Major Graham. "Come here, Laura. I can read what is written in your grandmamma's face at this moment, and it says, 'You are a tiresome little puss that nobody can keep in any order except Uncle David. Therefore, sit down beside him and eat as many almonds and raisins as he bids you.'" "You are a nice, funny Uncle David," whispered Laura, crushing her way in between his chair and Miss Percival's. "Nobody will need a tongue now, if you can read so exactly what we are all thinking." "But here is Miss Percival, still more wonderful, for she knows by the bumps on your head all that is contained inside. Let me see if I could do so. There is a large bump of reading, and a small one of writing and arithmetic. Here is a terrible organ of breaking dolls and destroying frocks. There is a very small bump of liking Uncle David, and a prodigious one of liking almonds and raisins." "No, you are quite mistaken. It is the largest bump for loving Uncle David, and the small one for everything else," interrupted Laura eagerly. "I shall draw a map of my head some day to show you how it is all divided." "And leave no room for anything naughty or foolish. Your head should be swept out and put in order every morning, that not a single cobweb may remain in your brains. What busy brains they must be for the next 10 years! But in the meantime, let us hope that you will never again be reduced to your last clean frock." End of Chapter 5. Recording by Kieran Metz, Columbus, Ohio.
Chapter 6 of Holiday House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosalind Walsh, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. Holiday House by Catherine Sinclair. Chapter 6. The Long Ladder. There was a young pickle, and what do you think? He lived upon nothing but victuals and drink. Victuals and drink were the chief of his diet, and yet this young pickle could never be quiet. One fine sultry day in the month of August, Harry and Laura stood at the breakfast-room window, wondering to see the large broken white clouds, looking like curds and whey, while the sun was in such a blaze of heat that everything seemed almost red-hot. The street door had become blistered by the sunbeams. Jowler the dog lay basking on the pavement. The green blinds were closed at every opposite house. The few gentlemen who ventured out were fanning themselves with their pocket-handkerchiefs. The ladies were strolling lazily along under the umbrageous shade of their green parasols, and the poor people, who were accustomed in winter to sell matches for lighting a fire, now carried about gaudy paper hangings for the empty grates. Lady Harriet found the butter so melted at breakfast that she could scarcely lift it on her knife, and Uncle David complained that the sight of hot smoking tea put him in a fever, and said he wished it could be iced. "I wonder how iced porridge would taste," said Harry. "I put mine at the open window to cool, but that only made it seem hotter. We were talking of the gentleman you mentioned yesterday, who toasted his muffins at a volcano, and certainly yours might almost be done at the drawing-room window this morning. Wait till you arrive at the countries I have visited, where, as somebody remarked, the very salamanders die of heat. At Agra, which is the hottest part of India, we could scarcely write a letter, because the ink dries in the pen before you can get it to the paper. I was obliged, when our regiment was there, to lie down in the middle of the day, during several hours, actually gasping for breath, and to make up for that, we all rose at midnight. An officer of ours, who lived long in India, got up always at 3 in the morning, after we returned home, and walked about the streets of Portsmouth, wondering what had become of everybody. "I shall try not to grumble about weather any more," said Laura. "We seem no worse off than other people. Or rather, we are a great deal better off. At Bermuda, where my regiment stopped on the way to America, the inhabitants are so tormented with high winds that they build hurricane houses, low flat rooms, where the families must retire when a storm comes on, as trees, houses, people, and cattle are all whirled about with such violence, that not a life is safe on the island while it lasts." "That reminds me," said Lady Harriet, "of a droll mistake made yesterday by the African camel, when he landed at Leith. His keepers were leading him along the high road to be made a show of in Edinburgh, at a time when the wind was particularly high, and the poor animal, encountering such clouds of dust, thought this must be a simoon of the desert, and threw himself flat down, burying his nose in the ground, according to custom on those occasions. It was with great difficulty that he could at last be induced to face the danger and proceed." "Quite a compliment to our dust," observed Laura. "But really, in such a hot day, the kangaroos and tigers might feel perfectly at home here. Oh, how I should like to visit the Geological Gardens in London!" "Then suppose we set off immediately," said Major Graham, pretending to rise from his chair. "Your grandmamma's donkey carriage holds 2." "Ah, but you could carry the donkey carriage more easily than it could carry you." "Shall I try? Well, if we go, who is to pay the turnpikes? For I remember the time, not 100 years ago, when Harry and you both thought that paying the gates was the only expense of travelling. You asked me then how poor grandmama could afford so many shillings and sixpences." "We know all about everything now, though," said Harry, nodding in a very sagacious manner. "I can tell exactly how much time it takes, going by the public coach to London, and it sleeps only one night on the road." "Sleeps!" cried uncle David. "What! It puts on a nightcap and goes to bed?" "Yes, and it dines and breakfasts too, Mr. Uncle David, for I heard Mrs. Crabtree say so." "Never name anybody, unless you wish to see her immediately," said Major Graham, hearing a well-known tap at the door. "As sure as you mention an absent person, if he is supposed to be 50 miles off at the time, it is rather odd, but he instantly appears. Then there is somebody that I shall speak about very often." "Who can this Mr. Somebody be?" asked uncle David, smiling. "A foolish person that spoils you both, I dare say, and gives you large slices of bread and jelly like this. Hold them carefully. Now good-bye, and joy be with you." But it was with rather rueful faces that Harry and Laura left the room, wishing they might have remained another hour to talk nonsense with uncle David, and dreading to think what new scrapes and difficulties they would get into in the nursery, which always seemed to them a place of torture and imprisonment. Major Graham used to say that Mrs. Crabtree should always have a thermometer in her own room when she dressed, to tell her whether the weather was hot or cold, for she seemed to feel no difference, and scarcely ever made any change in her own attire, wearing always the same pink gown and scarlet shawl, which made her look like a large red flower pot, while she was no more annoyed with the heat than a flower pot would have been. On this very oppressive morning, she took as much pains in suffocating Harry with a silk handkerchief round his neck, as if it had been Christmas, and though Laura begged hard for leave to go without one of her 6 wrappings, she might as well have asked permission to go without her head, as Mrs. Crabtree seemed perfectly deaf upon the subject. "This day is so very cold and so very shivering," said Harry slyly, "that I suppose you will make Laura wear at least 50 shawls." "Not above 20," answered Mrs. Crabtree dryly. "Give me no more of your nonsense, Master Harry. This is no business of yours. I was in the world long before you were born, and must know best. So hold your tongue. None but fools and beggars need ever be cold." At last Mrs. Crabtree had heaped as many clothes upon her 2 little victims, as she was pleased to think necessary. So she sallied forth with them, followed by Betty, and proceeded towards the country, taking the sunny side of the road, and raising clouds of dust at every step, till Harry and Laura felt as if they had been made of wax, and were melting away. "Mrs. Crabtree," said Harry, "did you hear Uncle David's funny story yesterday?" One hot morning a gentleman was watching an ant's nest, when he observed that every little insect, as it came out, plucked a small leaf to hold over its head, as a parasol. "I wish we could find leaves large enough for us." "You must go to the Botanical Gardens, where one leaf of a palm tree was shown to grandmama, which measured 14 feet long," observed Laura. "How horrid these very warm countries must be, where the heat is all the year round like this." "You may well say that," answered Mrs. Crabtree. "I would not go to them East Indies, no, not if I were Governess General, to be running away with a tiger at your back, and sleeping with real live serpents twisted round the bedpost, and scorpions under your pillow. Catch me there! I'm often quite sorry for Master Frank, to think that his ship is maybe going that way. I'm told the very rats have such a smell in that outlandish place, that if they touch the outside of a bottle with their tails, it tastes of musk ever after, and when people are sitting comfortably down, expecting to enjoy their dinner, a swarm of great ants will come and fall, an inch thick, on all the side dishes. I've no desire whatever to see foreign parts." "But I wish to see every country in the universe," said Harry, "and I hope there will be a railroad all round the world before I am grown up. Only think, Mrs. Crabtree, what fun lion hunting must be, and catching dolphins, and riding on elephants." The pedestrians had now arrived at the pretty village of Corstorphine, where they were unexpectedly met by Peter Grey, who joined them without waiting to ask leave. Here the hills are so beautifully wooded, and the villas so charming, that Harry, Peter, and Laura stopped a moment to consider what house they would like best to live in. Near one side of the road stood a large cart of hay, on the top of which were several men, forking it in at the window of a high loft, which could only be entered by a long ladder that leaned against the wall. It was a busy, joyous scene, and soon attracted the children's whole attention, who were transfixed with delight, seeing how rapidly the people ran up and down with their pitchforks in their hands, and tilted the hay from the cart into the loft, while they had many jokes and much laughter among themselves. At last their whole business was finished, and the workmen drove away for another supply, to the neighbouring fields, where they had been raking and tossing it all morning, as merry as crickets. "What happy people!" exclaimed Harry, looking wistfully at the party, and wishing he might have scrambled into the cart beside them. "I would be a haymaker for nothing, if anybody would employ me. Would not you, Peter?" "It is very strange," said Master Grey, "why little ladies and gentlemen seem always obliged to endure a perfectly useless walk every day, as you and Laura are doing now. You never saw animals set out to take a stroll for the good of their healths. How odd it would be to see a couple of dogs set off for a country walk." "Miss Laura," said Mrs. Crabtree, "Master Harry may rest here for a minute or two with Master Peter, and let them count their fingers, while you come with Betty and me to visit a sick old aunt of mine who lives round the corner. But be sure, boys, you do not presume to wander about, or I shall punish you most severely. We are coming back in 2 minutes." Mrs. Crabtree had scarcely disappeared into a small, shabby-looking cottage, before Peter turned eagerly to Harry, with a face of great joy and importance, exclaiming, "Only see how very lucky this is! The haymakers have left their long ladder, standing on purpose for us. The window of that loft is wide open, and I must climb up immediately to peep in, because never in all my life did I see the inside of a hay loft before." "Nor I," added Harry. "Uncle David says that all around the floor there are deep holes, called mangers, down which food is thrown for the horses, so that they can thrust their heads in and take a bite whenever they choose. How I should hate to have my dinner hung up always before my nose in that way! Suppose the kitchen were placed above your nursery, and that Mrs. Marmalade showered down tarts and puddings, which were to remain there till you ate them. You would hate the sight of such things at last. But now, Harry, for the hayloft." Peter scrambled so rapidly up the ladder that he soon reached the top and instantly vanished in at the window, calling eagerly for Harry to follow. "You never saw such a nice, clean, funny place as this in all your life. Make haste! Come faster! Never mind crushing your hat or tearing your jacket. I'll put it all to rights. Ah, there, that's the thing! Walk up, gentlemen, walk up! The grand show, 6 pence each, and children half price." All this time Harry was slowly and with great difficulty picking his steps up the ladder, but a most troublesome business it was. First his foot became entangled in a rope, then his hat got squeezed so out of shape it looked perfectly tipsy. Next one of his shoes nearly came off, and afterwards he dropped his gloves. But at last he stumbled up in safety, and stood beside Peter in the loft, both laughing with delight at their own enterprise. The quantity of hay piled up on all sides astonished them greatly, while the nice wide floor between seemed larger than any drawing-room, and was certainly made on purpose for a romp. Harry rolled up a large ball of hay to throw at Peter, while he, in return, aimed at him, so they ran after each other round and round the loft, raising such a riot that the very rafters dirled. The hay now flew out in clouds, while they jumped over it, or crept under it, throwing handfuls about in every direction, and observing that this was the best playroom they had ever been in. "How lucky that we came here!" cried Peter. "I should like to stay an hour at least." "Oh, 2 hours, or 3, or all day," added Harry. "But what shall we do about Mrs. Crabtree? She has not gone to settle for life with that old sick aunt, so I am afraid we must really be hurrying back, in case she may find out our expedition, and that, you know, Peter, would be dreadful. Only fancy, Harry, if she sees you and me clinging to the ladder about half-way down, what a way she would be in!" "We had better make haste," said Harry, looking around. "What would grandmama say? I wish we had never come up." At this moment Harry was still more brought to his senses by hearing Mrs. Crabtree's voice exclaiming in loud, angry accents, "Where in all the world can those troublesome boys be gone? I must tether them to a tree the next time they are left together. Why, sure, they would not venture up that long ladder in the hayloft. If they have, they had better never come down again, for I shall shew who is master here." "Peter Grey would run up a ladder to the stars, if he could find one," replied Betty. "Here are Master Harry's gloves lying at the bottom of it. They can be gone nowhere else, for I have searched every other place. We must send the town crier with his bell after them, if they are not found up there." Mrs. Crabtree now seemed fearfully angry, while Laura began to tremble with fright for Harry, who was listening overhead, and did not know very well what to do, but foolishly thought it best to put off the evil hour of being punished as long as possible. So he and Peter silently crept in below a great quantity of hay, and hid themselves so cunningly that even a thief-catcher could scarcely have discovered their den. In this dark corner Harry had time to reflect, and to feel more and more alarmed and sorry for his misconduct, so he said in a very distressed voice, "Oh, Peter, what a pity it is ever to be naughty, for we are always found out, and always so much happier when we are good." "I wonder how Mrs. Crabtree will get up the long ladder," whispered Peter, laughing. "I would give my little finger and one of my ears to see her and Betty scrambling along." Harry had to pinch Peter's arm almost black and blue before he would be quiet, and by the time he stopped talking, Mrs. Crabtree and Betty were both standing in the hayloft, exceedingly out of breath with climbing so unusually high, while Mrs. Crabtree very nearly fell, having stumbled over a step at the entrance. "Why, sure, there's nobody here!" exclaimed she in a disappointed tone. "And what a disorderly place this is! I thought a hayloft was always kept in such nice order, with the floor all swept, but here is a fine mess! Those two great lumps of hay in the corner look as if they were meant for people to sleep upon." Harry gave himself up for lost when Mrs. Crabtree noticed the place where he and Peter had buried themselves alive. But to his great relief no suspicions seemed to have been excited, and neither of the two searchers were anxious to venture beyond the door after having so nearly tripped upon the threshold. "They must have been stolen by a gipsy, or perhaps fallen into a well," said Betty, who rather liked the bustle of an accident. "I always thought Master Peter would break his neck, or something of that kind. Poor thing! How distressed his papa will be!" "Hold your tongue," interrupted Mrs. Crabtree angrily. "I wish people would either speak sense or not speak at all. Did you hear a noise among the hay?" "Rats, I dare say, or perhaps a dog," answered Betty, turning hastily round, and hurrying down the ladder faster than she had come up. "I certainly thought something moved in yon far corner." "Where can that little shrimp of a boy be hid?" added Mrs. Crabtree, following. "He must have obedience knocked like a nail into his head, with a few good severe blows. I shall beat him to powder when once we catch him." "You may depend upon it," persisted Betty, "that some gipsy has got the boys for the sake of their clothes. It will be a great pity, because Master Harry had on his best blue jacket and trousers." No sooner was the loft cleared of these unwelcome visitors, than Harry and Peter began to recover from their panic, and jumped out of the hay, shaking themselves free from it, and skipping about in greater glee than ever. While they played about as they had done before, and tumbled as if they had been tumblers at Ducrow's, poor Harry got into such spirits that he completely forgot about the deep holes, called mangers, for containing the horses' food, till all at once, when Peter was running after him, he fell, with a loud crash, headlong into one of them. Oh, what a scream he gave! It echoed through the stable, terrifying a whole team of horses that were feeding there, more particularly the one into whose manger he had fallen. The horse gave a tremendous start when Harry plunged down close to his nose, and not being able to run away, he put back his ears, opened his mouth, and kicked and struggled in the most frightful manner, while Harry, who could not make his escape any more than the horse, shouted louder and louder for help. Peter did all he could to assist Harry in this extraordinary predicament, but finding it impossible to be of any use, he forgot their terror of Mrs. Crabtree in his fears about Harry, and rushed to the window, calling back their two pursuers, who were walking away at a great distance. He screamed and holloaed, and waved his handkerchief without ceasing, till at last Mrs. Crabtree heard him and turned round. But never was anybody more astonished than she was on seeing him there, so she scolded, stormed, and raged up to the very foot of the ladder. "Now you are the besiegers, and I am the garrison," cried Peter, when he saw Mrs. Crabtree panting and toiling in her ascent. "We must make a treaty of peace together, for I could tumble you over in a minute by merely pushing this end a very little more to one side." "Do not touch it, Master Peter," cried Mrs. Crabtree, almost afraid he was in earnest. "There is a good boy, be quiet." "A good boy!" whispered Peter to himself. What a fright Mrs. Crabtree must be in before she said that. The next moment Mrs. Crabtree snatched Harry out of the manger, and shook him with rage. She then scolded and beat him till he was perfectly stupefied with fright and misery, after which the whole party were allowed to proceed towards home, while Harry stumbled along the road and hung down his head, wishing 50 times over that he and Peter Grey had never gone up. End of Chapter 6. The Long Ladder.